Hi, this is Jeff Curto, and welcome to episode number 24 of Camera Position, a podcast about the creative side of photography. Well, first off, again, thank you so much for those of you who are leaving comments on the cameraposition.com blog site, as well as thank you very much to those of you who have left comments at the iTunes store. It turns out, I guess, that the way iTunes kind of promotes podcasts at that iTunes store is by virtue of some of those comments. So the more the merrier. If you feel the urge to comment on camera position, and if it's something that you're enjoying the content of, I'd really appreciate it if you'd drop a note there at the iTunes store. I know that about 90% or so of you are subscribed to Camera Position through iTunes. So if you have a few minutes, I really would appreciate you stopping by there, and that way we can get some more people listening, and the more people listening, the more people will have commenting, and the more the merrier. So thanks again to those of you who have done that, and those of you who haven't, take a couple of minutes to do it. I very much would appreciate that kind of support. Well, today's camera position is sort of a combo platter in a way. And those of you who've been following along know that some of the camera position podcasts have been about my own photography, and others have been about the photography of photographers that I particularly admire. And today is sort of a little bit of both. In camera position 23 from a few days ago, I talked about this photograph, a new image that I just made in Modica in Sicily, Sicilia. And I talked about the way in which the photograph came about in the previous episode of Camera Position, and the idea that sometimes we don't necessarily see the thing that we're most interested in when we are really looking for the picture that we think we're interested in. The other picture, the real picture, is somewhere else behind us, or in this case off to the left side. And as I've been looking at this photograph and working on it and trying to adjust tonality and so forth and so on, and making some proof prints of it, what I've discovered is that it is a picture that is organized by, in a way, being sort of disorganized. And I began thinking about that notion, and about how the photographs that I typically make tend to be very classically composed in that sort of rule of thirds sort of organizational structure, where the picture can be divided up tic-tac-toe fashion, and interesting objects occur at those intersections of those tic-tac-toe lines, and so forth and so on. And about how this picture really is different from that. And what it got me thinking about is a photograph, probably one of the greatest photographs made by Alfred Stieglitz, a photograph by Stieglitz called the Steerage, made in 1907. And this is a photograph that in my day job of teaching photography, I talk about quite a lot with my students for a number of reasons, mostly because this particular photograph was seen by Stieglitz as being a photograph that was more about the formal issues of the way the picture was constructed than it was about the way that this photograph talks about social issues. Now, first, let's talk about the social part of this picture. Here we have a photograph entitled The Steerage, and of course the steerage on ships, transatlantic or other kinds of vessels in the early part of the 20th century, and certainly in the 19th century as well. The steerage was where the people of lower class rode in a boat, where they booked their passage, and it was all they could afford. And the upper class people were up on the upper decks, and the lower class people were on the lower decks. If you saw the movie Titanic, you saw kind of a dramatic recreation of that idea of the upper and lower classes. So here we have a picture that Stieglitz has entitled The Steerage, taken at a time when that social aspect of the photograph would certainly have been understood by the viewers of the image. And yet what Stieglitz talked about relative to the image had nothing to do with the social stratification that we see in this picture. Let me talk a little bit about what Stieglitz said, a quotation from Stieglitz here, describing the moment when he saw the subject of this picture on a boat headed for Europe. "The scene fascinated me," said Stieglitz. "A round straw hat, the funnel leaning left, the stairway leaning right, the right drawbridge, its railings made of chain, white suspenders crossed on the back of a man below, circular iron machinery, a mast that cut into the sky, completing the triangle. I stood spellbound for a while. I saw shapes related to one another, a picture of shapes, and underlying it a new vision that held me. Simple people, the feeling of ship, ocean, sky." So the idea here is that Stieglitz is very interested in the sort of structural aspect of this picture. And intriguingly, it's a photograph that is built very much around the edges of the frame. Certainly not very much is happening in the center of the frame. And the idea of putting all of the material, pushing it in a way out to the edges of the frame is a really fascinating notion. And let me just be clear that I'm certainly not equating myself and my photographic efforts to the great master Alfred Stieglitz, but what I am trying to do is talk about the idea that sometimes when the structure of a photograph is more loose, there is this sort of wonderful game of association that we get to do. And some of what happens in this photograph is relating the things like the X of the suspenders on the back of the man to the X of the drawbridge and the mast that goes up, and the way in which the oval shape of the winch in the lower left corner of the image relates to the oval shape of the straw hat that the man is wearing on the upper deck. All of those things begin to become clear to us, partly because of the structural quality of the photograph, the way in which the photograph is constructed, and the idea of a picture very much built around the edges of the frame. And this particular photograph, for those of you who've spent any time looking at Stieglitz and his body of work, and I'll put a link in the blog page to a couple of good Stieglitz sites that would help you out if you're not real familiar with Alfred Stieglitz's body of work. But for Stieglitz, the main considerations were usually visual. And the social aspect, in fact, of this particular picture is not one that he, at least according to him, really picked up on until much later after looking at the picture for a number of years. But the idea of the way in which this picture is constructed is really what Stieglitz was most interested in. Again, that structure that's based around the exterior of the picture. And certainly Stieglitz was this sort of visionary artist who was looking at things right around the turn of the century, the same sorts of things that were being examined by Cubist artists. And it isn't beside the point that Stieglitz was showing Cubist artists like Braque and Brancusi and Picasso and so forth in his gallery in New York City. So he's being influenced by this whole idea of the way in which a picture could be structured. So I did sort of begin to associate some of the things that I had done in this photograph of the shadows and the railings with the way in which Stieglitz constructed a picture much more loosely than he typically would have. And the idea that that structure really was not based on the sort of classical proportions of the way pictures might have been structured previously. And certainly the way my photographs tend to be structured has a much more sort of, I don't know if rigid is the right way to say it, but a much more sort of planned out assignment of where the eye looks. And one of the things that I find fascinating about this new photograph that I made in Sicily is the idea that the picture is made up of many different parts, and the eye tends to travel back and forth across the image and looks at lots of different things across the surface of the picture. So part of what I wanted to get at today is that as photographers, it's very difficult for us to be ignorant of what has gone on before us. That's one of the reasons that where I teach photography. We have a history of photography course that is a required course for students in the program. And again, those of you who may be interested in, again, it's a much longer deal than camera position because each class session is around an hour and 45 minutes to 2 hours and 15 minutes. But on the cameraposition.com blog page, you'll find a link right at the top of the page to my History of Photography podcast. And there is a 15-week class up on the web. All of the lectures, all of the lecture notes, or all the lecture slides rather, are there as podcasts and available for you to download. So, and I know that a number of you are kind of cross-pollinating Camera Position and the History of Photography podcasts, and I thank you very much for listening to those. But the idea of knowing some things about where the visual aspects of our medium comes from, and knowing some things about the way in which we see as photographers. So when you find yourself confronted with a photograph and you begin to think, gee, I think I might have seen some visual aspects of an image like this before, take a look at where those pictures have come from. Where do ideas come from? And one of my goals is to fill my head with as many great photographs as I can so that when I see something, I don't necessarily think, there's a picture that looks like a Stieglitz, or there's a picture that looks like a Weston or an Adams or a Minor White or somebody like that. But rather that I begin to have all of those things sort of stew into my head and blend into a photograph that is uniquely my own. So don't be ignorant of your medium's past. Don't be ignorant of your medium's present. And one of the things that I would like to do in some future camera positions is talk about more contemporary photographers than some of the older photographers that we've talked about, and see what we can see about what's going on in more contemporary image making today. So thank you very much for listening to Camera Position, episode number 24. Again, I really appreciate those of you who've written in and made comments on the blog, and please keep doing so. I will look forward to hearing your comments about this episode or any other episode of Camera Position, and I'm always interested in what you have to say and what you'd like to hear and see on Camera Position, how you're using it, and how it's helping you in your photography. I'm also very interested in seeing what kind of photography you all do. So send me some links to websites or email me a JPEG or two, and I'd love to take a look. So thanks again for listening to episode number 24 of Camera Position, the podcast about the creative side of photography.